Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 991 for February 12th, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
You can't just ship alcohol across state lines in the back of a truck.
Last month's raid on the Justins House of Bourbon stores in Louisville and Lexington is still under investigation by Kentucky authorities, but it turns out there is more to the story. At the same time, District of Columbia liquor agents raided Justin's online sales operation in Washington and found hundreds of bottles of whiskey of questionable origin. No charges have been filed, but Justin's owners have been ordered to appear at a show cause hearing in Washington to explain themselves. Janet Patton of the Lexington Herald-Leader broke the story this week and joins me later on WhiskyCast In-Depth with the details. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
Hey friends, Gabriel Cardarella here again with Dewar's Scotch Whisky, and I have to say, Dewar's French Cask Smooth is a double-aged masterpiece, finished in apple brandy cask from Normandy to be unlike anything you've tried before. More in a bit.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
You know, people always ask me, does Redbreast go better with ice or without? Would it go well with figs, dark chocolate, apple crumble? Is there one particular thing I should enjoy it with? I tell them, yeah, other people.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. For the first time on record, distilled spirits hold a bigger market share of U.S. alcohol sales than either beer or wine. That's the key takeaway from Thursday's Distilled Spirits Council economic briefing. Tequila sales grew 11.5%, but sales of bourbons and other American whiskeys grew by 5.2%. Irish whiskey sales also showed another year of strong gains, but Canadian whiskey sales fell by 4.1%. Discus CEO Chris Swanger put the overall numbers into perspective.
This past year's economic data just affirms that the distilled spirits industry has remained resilient despite challenging economic headwinds. And with that, U.S. supplier revenue rose and grew 5.1%. And U.S. volume grew 4.8%. And we're really excited about that. This is the 13th straight market share gain for the U.S. distilled spirits industry. And so exciting to report. The big news is this is the first time spirits has taken the lead in revenue market share for the U.S. beverage alcohol marketplace.
Distilled spirits had a 42.1% market share compared to 41.9% for beer. One worrisome note, overall sales of single malt Scotch whiskies declined by 2.8% last year, though sales of so-called super premium single malts rose by 9%. Blended Scotch sales showed an increase of 0.6%. The U.S. remains the largest single market for Scotch whisky exports by value, with more than $1 billion worth of Scotch exported to the U.S. last year. That's a 33% gain and more than double France's second-place value. However, figures released Friday by the Scotch Whisky Association show India has taken over from France as the market leader by volume, with 219 million bottles exported to India last year, up 60% from 2021. Single malt exports globally grew by 30% over 2021's pandemic-affected numbers and now account for 32% of all Scotch whisky exports. The overall value of Scotch whisky exports worldwide hit a record £6.2 billion last year. More data-driven details to report. Kentucky bourbon tourism rebounded from the pandemic in a big way last year. More than 2.1 million people visited distilleries along the Kentucky Bourbon Trail during 2022. That's up 38% over 2019, the last full year before the pandemic. Those numbers do not include Buffalo Trace, which is not part of the Bourbon Trail. Buffalo Trace reported separately that nearly 471,000 people visited their distillery during 2022. Those visitors are getting a new experience this spring. The distillery has commissioned the second still house that will double Buffalo Trace's annual production. And the new still house will be part of the distillery's revived hard hat tours, which have not been available since 2019 because of construction work at Buffalo Trace. In other news, Woodford Reserve has just its third master distiller in the brand's 26-year history. Chris Morris is stepping back to become Master Distiller Emeritus, and his longtime assistant Elizabeth McCall has been promoted to the top job. I caught up with her Wednesday night at a Brown-Forman event in New York City, and she told me the move has been in the works for quite a while now.
You know, I've mentored with Chris for a decade now, but it wasn't until a couple weeks ago that it was like, we're going to do it. This is the time frame, and it's happening. So I was not expecting it when it happened. So I knew it was coming, but I wasn't expecting it when it was happening. So
you're only the third master distiller in Woodford history behind Lincoln Henderson and Chris Morris. Well, how does that make you feel?
Quite honestly, it's a little overwhelming, but in a very good way. It's a wonderful brand, and where it's going is incredible, and I think that I've been mentored in the right way to carry it forward, but it's very hard to wrap my head around.
Now, one technical question. Chris is still in charge at Old Forester, right?
Correct.
You're not going to take over that portfolio anytime soon, are you?
No, there's no plan for me to take over Old Forester. Chris is still happily working on King, Kentucky, Old Forester, and lending support to Cooper's, still with Woodford. I can consult with him, and then and on Jack Daniels every once in a while he'll help.
How long will it take for you to put your fingerprints on Woodford Reserve now that you're the master distiller?
I've already kind of started in a lot of ways. I mean, we're not going to change anything with the core expressions. But when it comes to Masters Collection and Distillery Series, Chris has already handed that over to me to manage, so I'll continue to do that. And but it won't be for probably 7 more years until my first release comes out. So patience is a virtue.
Chris Morris's latest Woodford Reserve Masters Collection release was also unveiled this week, and Chris went back into history for this release to play with barrel entry proof. The release was made with new make filled into the barrel at 50% ABV or 100 proof, the way it was done in the 19th century. The current barrel entry standard for Woodford is 55%, but Morris says allowing a little more water at the start gives the whiskey a better chance to pull more flavors out of the wood. It'll be available in limited quantities for $129.99 a bottle in the U.S. and select global markets. Boondocks Bourbon is out with its oldest release yet. The 18-year-old Boondocks is part of the Signature Series collection. Longtime master distiller Dave Shurick sourced the barrels that went into creating the Boondocks 18.
This 18-year-old came by and was like, wow, we got about some of this stuff. So we did, and there wasn't very much available, as you can imagine. So we purchased like 40 barrels, I think. And then what we did, we kind of wanted to not put it all out there at once, so we separated the barrels in 3 different totes. So we produced and bottled all 3 totes at the same time, but they'll be released in 3 different lots in 3 different years.
Only 1,620 bottles will be available in this year's release, with a recommended retail price of $279.99 each. Heaven Hill is launching a barrel-proof edition of its Bernheim Straight Wheat Whiskey. Barrel-proof versions have been available for the past year or so at the Heaven Hill Bourbon Experience in Bardstown, Kentucky, but now they'll be available nationally with 2 batches a year, similar to the Elijah Craig and Larceny barrel-proof whiskeys. Look for the Bernheim to start showing up later this month with a recommended retail price of $64.99 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Pinhook Whiskey has launched the second bourbon in its collaboration series with Garrett Oliver of Brooklyn Brewing. The whiskey was distilled in Austin, Texas, and aged for 4 years in the Texas heat. Proceeds from the sales of Collaboration Number 2 will benefit the Michael J. Jackson Foundation for Brewing and Distilling, which awards scholarships to people of color who want to study brewing and distilling. In Scotch whisky, Springbank has released its annual new releases, including the 11-year-old local barley and 25-year-old single malts, along with 2 8-year-old Kilkerran cask strength releases, one matured in sherry casks, and the other in bourbon barrels for the first time since 2018. There's no word on pricing. Chivas is out with Altus XX, a 20-year-old sequel to its Altus blended scotch. It honors 5 generations of Chivas master blenders by using malts from Strathisla, Altavane, Breval, Longmorn, and Tormore, along with grain from Strathclyde Distillery. There's no word on pricing. And finally, treasure hunters are hoping to recover bottles of whiskey lost in a 170-year-old shipwreck. Back in 1854, the Westmoreland sank in Lake Michigan with gold and 280 barrels of whiskey on board, along with a crew of 17. Ross Richardson discovered the shipwreck in 2010 and is trying to get a permit to salvage some of the gold coins and whiskey from the wreckage. It's not known whether the whiskey held up after 170 years in icy waters. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com and on our social media timelines. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. We have lots going on around the world this month. This coming weekend brings us the Vienna Whiskey Convention in Austria, the Whiskey Affair in Haslemere, England, Whiskey Wonderland 2023 in Hammond, Ontario, and the New Mexico Spirits Showcase in Red River, New Mexico. The Bourbon Classic is February 22nd through the 25th in Louisville, and the Kentucky Derby Museum kicks off its 2023 Bourbon Legends series of tastings with the folks from Kentucky Peerless Distilling on the 23rd. Whiskey X Miami is March 2nd, and the rescheduled Dramfest 2022 will be on March 4th and 5th in Christchurch, New Zealand. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it, and we'll be glad to add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. Last month, Kentucky alcohol agents raided the 2 Justins House of Bourbon stores in Louisville and Lexington. They seized whiskey that may have violated the state's vintage spirits law. No charges have been filed, and the stores were allowed to stay open. But this week we found out that on the same day, District of Columbia and federal agents raided the Justins online operation in Washington and have accused Justins of 11 different local code violations, including illegal transportation of alcohol into the district and unlawfully importing whiskeys from outside the U.S., including highly sought-after bottles of Blanton's, Weller, and other Sazerac products. Hundreds of bottles of Blanton's and Weller, including Blanton's Minis labeled for the Chinese market, were placed under, quote, voluntary detention by federal agents. The D.C. case report obtained by the Lexington Herald-Leader quotes a federal investigator as saying Sazerac product is more lucrative than heroin right now, and it also indicates that a separate federal probe is underway into alleged counterfeiting of Sazerac whiskeys. The owners of Justins have been ordered to appear at a show cause hearing in Washington to defend themselves on the code violations, But so far, those are the only accusations that have been filed, and a lawyer for Justins has not returned our request for comment on their side of the case. Janet Patton of the Herald-Leader broke the story this week of the parallel raid and investigations in at least 2 other states. She joins me with more details. Let's talk about, first of all, what happened here. We know what Justins had gotten in trouble for doing, or at least what we thought they had gotten in trouble for was having some bottles that didn't quite meet the standards of the Vintage Bourbon Act or the Vintage Spirits Act in Kentucky. Well, but it's more than that.
Well, kind of back up because, you say that like the Vintage Bourbon Act actually has standards, and I'm not really sure that it does. I mean, the standard is a pretty low bar. Right now, the law is written to allow anything that is not available from a distributor. That's a pretty wide door. If your distributor doesn't have it, then you could say, well, then I could just buy it from you, from me. If I walk in the door with a bottle of something and they say, you got that, that's amazing. Yes, my distributor doesn't have Blanton's or Weller. I will buy that from you. And it's all above board and perfectly legal, apparently. So we don't really know what the Kentucky raid specifically was about. But having seen the case file from the report, that was from the DC raid that happened on the same day, it kind of shed some light on what was going on behind the scenes. And it seems like this all kind of got kicked off with some complaints about shipping. So in Kentucky, a retailer cannot ship alcohol to someone out of state. The distillery can now, but a retailer can't. And I'm pretty sure I've got that right because I've been looking it up. So apparently what happened was an ABC investigator from Kentucky sent some agents in to Justins. They bought a bottle. They asked about shipping. They said, yeah, we can't do that. And then according to the case file, they opened the bottle. They had a few drinks with the owner, and the name is not in the case file. It just says the owner. And then the owner said, I could drive this to DC and ship it from there. And I think that sort of triggered the larger investigation because, you can't just ship alcohol across state lines in the back of a truck. And you can ship alcohol from DC, and they did have an internet sales license out of DC. But according to the case file, when the DC investigators started poking into it, the employee told them that they were driving alcohol back and forth. Sometimes it was coming into Kentucky and then going to DC and shipping out. Sometimes it was coming into DC and then driving to Kentucky. And I think that's where they ran afoul of the law, according to the case file. I mean, I'm not a legal expert, so I'm just going by what the investigators said. So that's a big chunk of it right there. And then you start looking at what is this alcohol that is moving back and forth, and where did it come from? And that started to get sort of interesting as well.
We didn't even know about the DC investigation at first, did we?
I didn't. No, I had no idea. And, I think I had heard something about, Justins or someone having an online site where you could order alcohol. But I thought in my mind, well, I'm sure they just mean like, Liquor Barn, where I can go online and say, I'm looking for a bottle of XYZ. And then you can get it. It never dawned on me that it was this big an operation. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of bottles, cases and cases of a wide range of things in the pictures that are part of this case file. Blanton's, including, I did not even know that these mini bottles existed, which is kind of fascinating to me. These teeny weeny Blanton minis that apparently were from the Chinese. They're exported to China, which I thought was really an interesting. I kind of want to know more just about that, if that's legitimate.
That sounds legitimate, because I know that Age International, which owns Blanton's and has the rights outside the U.S., does export to China and does export all over the place. And Buffalo Trace controls the rights to Blanton's in the U.S., so we should emphasize that.
That's interesting. That's interesting. But why would they make a mini one? I don't know. I mean, I guess because someone will buy it. That's the only reason anybody does anything, is because someone will pay for it. But I guess it's a status symbol. If you've got if you've got this little, because they're 50 milliliter, they're very small.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the minis thing I find fascinating. But apparently Justins had been importing quite a bit from overseas. And specifically, what the investigators talked about in their case file were something like 600 bottles of Blanton's that it sounds like they were importing from the Netherlands. And the reason that was particularly interesting to the investigators and to the federal authorities is because apparently they have a lot of trouble with counterfeits coming out of the Netherlands. Now, are these real? Are these counterfeits? I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know if the federal authorities know at this point. They put, I think all of those bottles were put in voluntary detention, and some of them were also taken as evidence. So are they checking? Probably.
Yeah, because Buffalo Trace has a lab, as you pointed out in your story, that can verify the authenticity of this stuff and if it really is Blanton's.
I don't think, I'm not sure it's gotten quite to that stage yet. I think all this is still just like at the very, beginning of the investigation. So I don't know if they even know yet. I mean, there's two questions there. So could these bottles be legal imports? And the answer is yes, they could be. According to the case file, they didn't have the right paperwork to do it. So one of the things they talked about was, they were not, Justins was not the importer of record. And they also said they were operating as a wholesaler, but they don't have a wholesaler's license. And, that that's just a whole different animal from the retailer. So, set aside the question of whether or not it's a legitimate, if it's a counterfeit or a legal bourbon, could they legitimately bring this product in? I think that has to be established. And then the second question is, what was the product? So that's kind of down the road.
And once again, we should emphasize that we're not accusing Justins of counterfeiting these whiskeys.
Yeah, no charges have been filed, and in that I'm aware of in any state or in DC. However, I will tell you that I just learned that the DC Alcohol Board has ordered a show cause hearing for Justins. So this case has been sent to the DC Attorney General, and they will come back with the charging document, and then they will set a hearing date, and Justins will have to show cause for why they should not be found liable for these potential violations.
Any idea when that hearing is set for?
It hasn't. This was all coming out of the hearing that they held Tuesday in D.C. This is the D.C. Alcohol Board, and that was a closed hearing. So this is all I really know about what was said at it, was the board disposition. But there's just so many, strange things in this case file. There's the 600 bottles of Weller that Justins apparently bought from something called Star Liquidation. And when they started looking at it, they couldn't find Star Liquidation. It's on paper, but it doesn't really exist. And it doesn't have any liquor licenses. And so they talked to Pennsylvania authorities, which is where this company apparently was supposed to be. And they really want to know where this Weller came from. They have some, there's some names in here that they're looking for. And I think Pennsylvania is now part of this investigation. I should say that according to the case file, Kentucky authorities knew that Justins had received cease and desist orders from 2 states for apparently shipping alcohol improperly. And I asked the state of Kentucky, I don't know what those 2 states are, but Texas apparently is involved because whether they were one of the ones that sent the cease and desist order, Texas also has questions about a shipment to a Texas distillery that Justins. It sounds like from the case file that Justins sent to the distillery. That's a little confusing to me. Why would Justins be shipping bottles to a distillery? I don't know. But, again, there's a lot of just odd things in this story.
Including one that you mentioned about an illegal bottling operations operating somewhere in Kentucky that came up in the case file that nobody has really reported on yet.
Yeah. And, so far no one really will talk about that. So I don't know quite what to make of that. It's mentioned by, I think it was allegedly told to the investigators by someone at Buffalo Trace, someone at Sazerac. I'm not sure that Sazerac is embracing that she said that. I'm not sure how to put this, but they would like to sort of step back from that statement is my impression. So, whether there's an illegal bottling operation, I think to most people that would say you would think we're talking about like a plant, but it might be something much smaller scale. It might be something more along the lines of a mom and pop. If you remember, this came up last fall. I found this when I was trying to dig around and discover more about this stuff. There was a case that came up in one of the trade presses, and I can't remember which one it was off the top of my head, about a label maker, a printer in Ohio, who said they had been asked to make some Weller labels and had called Buffalo Trace, had called Sazerac and said, is this you? And it wasn't. So I think we kind of need to realize that the idea that there are people making fake labels for bottles is not that far-fetched. The idea that it's like a big giant plant, maybe not. But if you start thinking smaller, like in your garage, that you just pick up empties refill, and then stick a label on. I don't know that that's that far-fetched. Now,
not at all. That's how most counterfeiting operations get started.
I'm not trying to say that Justins or anyone else is involved in this.
No.
Aside from what I told you about, the case that was mentioned about the labels and the fact that this has been floated, that's really all I have to go on. But I think part of the issue is for a lot of people, when you think of counterfeiting, you're thinking ginormous, but it's not. I think it's much smaller than that.
The one quote you had in the article that made me open my eyes a lot was when somebody mentioned that Sazerac products are more profitable than heroin on the black market these days because of the demand for everything from Pappy to Blanton's to Weller. Yeah.
That just really, that stunned me. It was a federal agent, a federal official who was alleged to have said that. And that just stunned me when I saw that, because it boggled my mind to think that this has become so big and so ubiquitous, and there's so much money to be made that the people are willing to go to great lengths, really, really work at it to make this happen. It just boggled my mind.
You've been in touch with the lawyers for everybody concerned in this one. What do the lawyers for Justins have to say about it, or anything?
They've not commented at all on the record to me. And I've asked a lot. So I've told them I'm here. If your clients ever want to give an interview, I really would love to hear their side of things. I'm sure that they have things to say, but the lawyers really have not said anything at all. The only thing that I can tell you is when the raids first happened in January, both sides, I think Justins put out a statement on Facebook, and then another attorney for one of the investors in Justins said that they were cooperating with the investigation. So that's really the last official comment from what we've had that I've seen.
Does all this surprise you?
Yes and no. I mean, I think we all knew about Pappy and kind of the craze, and there had been a couple of stories around for a while of people who were counterfeiting Pappy, who were buying empty bottles. I think I had heard of someone who heard from somebody else about somebody who went so far as to buy the machine that puts the cork and the label back on the top of it, which is an expensive piece of machinery, I'm imagining. So you must see the profit margin must be huge. But with something like, Pappy, Van Winkle, where people were just kind of, they don't seem to have good sense. You can kind of see that. And, frankly, I have wondered, has it been extended to other brands that would have less scrutiny? But on another level, yes, it really does surprise me. And I think a lot of people were fairly surprised by this, based on some of the comments I've had privately from people who were bourbon fans. I think they were fairly surprised by this.
Once again, we have reached out to attorney Tom Bullock, who represents Justins House of Bourbon. He has not returned our email seeking an interview on this story, and it is important to remember that no charges have been filed other than the alleged code violations in the District of Columbia. We'll keep following this story as it develops. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's start off with the Bernheim barrel proof that I mentioned during the news. I received a sample this week, bottled at 59.4% ABV. The nose is sweet, with touches of caramel, honey, and a hint of spice. The taste has a nice balance of caramel and honey, with clove and hints of leather and linseed oil in the background. And the finish is long and sweet, with caramel, honey, and lingering spice. I'm scoring the Bernheim barrel proof batch A223 a 92. Next up, the Shizuoka Contact S single malt from Japan. It's bottled at 55.5% ABV, and the nose is nice and malty with touches of honey, vanilla, soft oak, and dried fruits. The taste has tartness and spice with lemon zest, chili powder, black pepper, honey, and vanilla. The finish is long and spicy with a subtle citrusy tartness, and I'm scoring the Shizuoka Contact S single malt a 91. Finally, let's look at the latest release from Compass Box. Delos is a tribute to the venerable Asilo blended Scotch and features malts from Glenelgan, Milton Duff, and the Old Imperial Distillery. It's bottled at 49% ABV and has a tropical nose with pineapple and orange peel, along with honey and vanilla. The taste is thick and luscious with notes of white pepper, pineapple, honey, orange, and pears. The finish, long and fruity with a lingering touch of spice. I'm scoring the Compass Box Delos a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit, a 100-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, double oak, cask strength, or reserve series of ryes, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails at a retailer near you. Visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly.
Gabriel here again. Dewar's Master Blender Stephanie McLeod has been doing some amazing things with cask finishing lately, and Dewar's French Cask Smooth is no exception. It's the 5th addition to the Dewar's Cask Finishing Series. This 8-year whiskey is double-aged, then finished in Calvados casks to blend together the best of Scottish distilling and aging with the finest in French brandy maturation. The nose is sweet honey and citrus in perfect balance. Taste it, and you'll get this unmistakable note of baked apple, citrus, and a hint of cinnamon spice. Now, I recommend it this time of year as an apple cinnamon highball, using lemon juice, simple syrup, unfiltered apple juice, and club soda, or simply enjoy it on its own. Either way, it's a specially crafted reward for your curiosity.
Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Traditionally, whiskey barrels have been stored on their sides, whether it's in dunnage-style warehouses where barrels are stacked 3 high on top of each other, or placed in racks. That takes up a lot of space, though, and more distilleries are switching to palletized storage, where they top-fill the barrel through a bung hole in the head instead of the side of the barrel, then store the barrel standing up with 4 or 6 to a pallet. Instead of rolling barrels into place, a forklift operator moves them into stacks that can be 7 barrels high, towering over the warehouse floor. Just like in dunnage-style warehouses, the barrels on the bottom support the weight of those on higher levels, but the heads of each barrel are blocked from getting any air contact. As a result, palletization has its critics, including longtime bourbon distiller Dave Shurick.
If you think about palletizing whiskey barrels. You put 4 barrels on a pallet, you're blocking 25% of the barrel from getting any interaction with the environment. And then the tendency is to put stack pallets on top of pallets and scoot them close together.
Schurig feels so strongly about palletization that several years ago he pulled Boondock's whiskey production from the O.Z. Tyler, now Green River Distillery, over the management's plans to start palletizing its whiskeys. He switched to Wilderness Trail Distillery, which still stores barrels on their sides, but is now looking for a new distillery to make Boondocks. As we reported recently, Wilderness Trail has been sold to Campari, and the new owners want to get out of the contract production business. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and a complete archive of all of our past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. You can get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address, comments at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
The average college basketball power forward is 6'9", which, according to my rough calculations, is 16.5 times my height. I'll stick to aimlessly pottering around in back gardens.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Friends, it's me again, reminding you to try Dewar's French Cask Smooth Blended Scotch Whisky. The best of 2 cultures and traditions in one beautiful bottle. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.